When word first got out that wildlife officials in Florida were preparing to turn loose hundreds of snakes into a landscape already crawling with reptiles, the internet did what the internet always does. It laughed. Comment sections filled with jokes about a state that seemed to have a permanent talent for making bizarre headlines. Late-night hosts riffed on it. Strangers online asked, only half joking, if Florida had simply run out of good ideas and settled for the strangest one on the list. But strip away the punchlines, and what remained was something far more serious. A wetland ecosystem worth billions of dollars was quietly dying, and traditional methods of stopping the collapse had already failed for the better part of 2 decades. The plan that sounded like satire was, in truth, a calculated last resort built on years of careful science. To understand why anyone would fight snakes with more snakes, you have to go back to where the disaster actually began. Not with an announcement, but with a storm. Before the crisis, the Everglades was one of the most singular places on the planet. Endless fields of sawgrass rolled toward the horizon, interrupted only by slow-moving water and the calls of wading birds. Otters slid through the canals, deer moved along the tree islands, and bobcats prowled the edges of the marsh. It was a fully working system, ancient and self-sustaining, generating an estimated tens of billions of dollars a year in economic value through tourism, fisheries, and flood protection for South Florida communities. Nobody expected that balance to break. But in 1992, a powerful hurricane tore across the southern part of the state, destroying homes, businesses, and, critically, at least one facility housing exotic reptiles. In the chaos of the storm's aftermath, a number of large snakes escaped into the wetlands surrounding Miami. Around the same time, the exotic pet trade was booming, and Burmese pythons, once sold as novelty pets, were growing far larger and far more difficult to manage than their owners had anticipated. Some were simply released into the canals and marshes, quietly abandoned by people who assumed the warm, wet landscape would either kill them or absorb them harmlessly. It did neither. The Everglades turned out to be close to ideal habitat for a python. Warm year-round, thick with cover, and overflowing with prey that had never evolved defenses against a snake capable of swallowing something the size of a full-grown deer. For years, the sightings were treated as isolated curiosities. Then the numbers started climbing and climbing until wildlife biologists could no longer pretend it was a minor issue. Today, researchers estimate the population of Burmese pythons living wild in South Florida ranges somewhere between the tens of thousands and several 100,000 individuals. A single female can produce dozens of eggs in one clutch, and with no natural predator willing or able to hunt a snake that size, survival rates for young pythons have been unusually high. The mathematics of an invasive apex predator with almost no population control is brutal, and the Everglades has felt every bit of it. Surveys conducted over the past 2 decades paint a grim picture. Populations of raccoons, possums, and rabbits in heavily infested areas have crashed by well over 90%. Bobcat sightings have dropped sharply. Deer, once common throughout the wetlands, have become far rarer in areas where python density is highest. It isn't only about animals being eaten directly. Prey species also abandon habitat that has become dangerous, shifting the entire structure of the food web. The marsh that once buzzed with movement grew unsettlingly still, and almost nobody outside a small circle of biologists noticed until the damage was already deep. What makes the Burmese python so difficult to fight isn't aggression or venom. It's the fact that Florida's climate and geography seem almost engineered for its success. The heat and humidity mirror its native range in Southeast Asia. The dense grass and murky water provide cover so effective that even trained hunters walking within a few feet of a python can miss it entirely. Its skin pattern breaks up its outline against the reeds, turning a 15-foot animal into something that can vanish in plain sight. These snakes also grow to a genuinely staggering size. Individuals exceeding 15 feet and well over 100 pounds are not unusual, and some captured specimens have topped 20 feet. Footage of pythons wrestling alligators for dominance has circulated widely, a jarring reminder that this newcomer wasn't slipping quietly into the ecosystem. It was competing for the top spot in it. The economic stakes tied to all this are enormous. The Everglades supports drinking water supplies, flood control infrastructure, commercial and recreational fishing, and a tourism industry that draws visitors from around the world specifically to see the wildlife now vanishing from python-heavy zones. Despite 2 decades of removal efforts, hunters and contractors have managed to pull out only a fraction of the estimated population, a number that sounds impressive in isolation but barely dents the total when population estimates run into the tens of thousands or higher. The snakes kept breeding faster than anyone could remove them, and officials began quietly admitting what many had feared for years. This was not a problem that could simply be hunted away. Florida did not sit idle. If anything, the state tried nearly everything within its power. Public hunting competitions were launched, drawing in ordinary citizens armed with hooks, bags, and a willingness to wade into some of the most difficult terrain in North America. These events grew from small local gatherings into major annual competitions, drawing hundreds of participants from across the country and even from abroad, competing for cash prizes and bragging rights for the largest or most pythons captured in a set window of time. The results made headlines every year, but the underlying math never changed. Even in record-breaking years, the total number of snakes removed represented a tiny sliver of the estimated wild population. It was, as more than one biologist admitted, like trying to bail out a flooding boat with a teaspoon. Beyond public hunts, the state brought in dedicated contract hunters, paid to track and remove pythons full-time using specialized tracking techniques. Scientists experimented with radio tagging captured male pythons and releasing them back into the wild during breeding season, using them as living guides that would lead researchers straight to reproductive females, a technique researchers nicknamed the scout snake method. Thermal sensing devices, detection dogs trained to recognize python scent, and drone surveillance were all deployed across the wetlands in an attempt to locate snakes that were otherwise nearly impossible to find visually. Each new tool brought incremental progress, and each incremental gain was matched by the sheer reproductive output of the population. Since organized removal campaigns began in earnest, contractors and hunters have collectively removed tens of thousands of pythons from the wild, an effort representing an enormous amount of labor, funding, and expertise. And yet, by most scientific estimates, that total still accounts for only a small percentage of the snakes actually living in South Florida's wetlands. The uncomfortable conclusion, one that took years for officials to say plainly, was that complete eradication was likely impossible. The best realistic outcome was containment and gradual population suppression, not elimination. While the python itself dominated headlines, a second and far quieter threat was spreading almost unnoticed. Riding along with the invasive snakes was a parasite scientist called the snake lungworm, an organism native to Southeast Asia that had never before existed in Florida's ecosystem. Once pythons carrying the parasite established themselves in the wetlands, the lungworm found its own path into the local food web. The cycle works like a slow chain reaction. Python waste carries the parasite's eggs into the environment. Insects, particularly cockroaches, pick up the eggs while feeding on that waste. Small amphibians and lizards eat the infected insects. Native snakes, hunting those same lizards and frogs, unknowingly swallow the parasite along with their meal. Once inside a snake's body, the larvae migrate from the digestive tract into the lungs, where they mature and multiply. For many native snake species, especially smaller-bodied ones, this infection can be devastating. Heavy lungworm burdens cause labored breathing, lung damage, and a steady decline in the animal's ability to hunt effectively, sometimes leading to starvation. Researchers examining infected snakes have documented serious respiratory damage and, in extreme cases, parasites emerging visibly from an animal's airway. What makes this especially alarming is how far and how independently the lungworm has spread. It has now been documented in more than a dozen native snake species across a wide swath of Florida, reaching well beyond the original python hotspots in a central and even northern parts of the state. Unlike the pythons themselves, the lungworm doesn't need its original host to keep expanding. It has become self-sustaining within Florida's native snake populations, meaning that even a hypothetical total removal of every python would not stop its spread. There is, however, one small silver lining buried in this otherwise bleak discovery. The Florida cottonmouth, a native venomous species, appears to show unusual resistance to the parasite compared to other native snakes. Scientists aren't yet sure why, whether it's genetic, dietary, or some other factor entirely, but it stands as one of the few genuinely hopeful data points in an otherwise troubling story. What began as a fight against one invasive predator had quietly become a fight against an entire cascade of secondary consequences, most of which the public never heard about. It was against this backdrop of years of expensive, only partially effective control efforts that officials announced a very different kind of strategy: the deliberate release of eastern indigo snakes, a large native, non-venomous species, into parts of the Everglades and surrounding habitat. On paper, to anyone unfamiliar with the science behind it, the announcement sounded almost like a parody of environmental policy. A state already infamous for its snake problem was now, apparently, adding more snakes on purpose. The public reaction was immediate and merciless. Social media filled with jokes comparing the plan to famous ecological blunders of the past, including the introduction of mongooses to some Pacific islands specifically to control rats, an experiment that famously backfired and created new problems rather than solving old ones. Talk shows built entire segments around the absurdity of the headline. Even some wildlife advocates initially hesitated to defend the plan publicly, wary of how it looked to a public already exhausted by years of python-related bad news. What almost none of the critics realized was that the eastern indigo snake wasn't some random substitute thrown into the mix out of desperation. It was, in fact, one of North America's most effective natural snake hunters, a species that had once ranged across a huge swath of the southeastern United States before habitat destruction and overcollection pushed it to the edge of extinction. Reintroducing it wasn't a knee-jerk reaction to python headlines. It was the culmination of a restoration program that conservation biologists had been quietly building for years, long before public pressure over pythons reached a boiling point. To understand why scientists were willing to bet on this particular species, it helps to understand what the eastern indigo snake actually is. Historically found from Florida up through the Carolinas and as far west as parts of Mississippi and Alabama, it is one of the longest native snakes in North America, with confirmed individuals stretching close to 9 feet. Its scales carry a glossy, almost iridescent blue-black sheen, often paired with a reddish-orange blush along the throat and chin that gives it a strikingly regal look. One of the reasons researchers and conservationists have long referred to it affectionately as the emperor of southeastern woodlands. Unlike venomous predators that rely on toxins to subdue prey, the indigo snake hunts through raw strength, speed, and confidence. It has an unusually broad diet, feeding on rodents, birds, frogs, and other reptiles, including venomous snakes. Remarkably, indigo snakes appear to have a natural resistance to the venom of species like rattlesnakes, allowing them to prey on animals that would be lethal to most other predators. Rather than constricting prey the way many large snakes do, an indigo typically overpowers and swallows it directly, a hunting style that makes it especially effective against smaller, similarly sized snakes, including juvenile pythons. The species' historical range once stretched across tens of millions of acres of longleaf pine forest and sandy scrubland throughout the southeast. But logging, agricultural expansion, and unregulated collection for the exotic pet trade devastated both the snake and its habitat over the course of the 20th century. Compounding the problem, indigo snakes rely heavily on the burrows dug by gopher tortoises for shelter during colder months, and as tortoise populations decline from habitat loss, and during harder economic times, direct hunting for food, indigo populations collapsed alongside them. By the late 1970s, the species had lost the overwhelming majority of its historic range and was formally listed as federally threatened, surviving only in scattered pockets, primarily in Florida and small areas of neighboring states. Despite this near collapse, the species retained the one trait that made a comeback story possible. Unlike a manufactured solution or an imported control agent, the indigo snake was already adapted to this exact landscape, and it already knew how to hunt other snakes without fear. While the reintroduction program moved forward quietly, something else was happening across the Everglades that few had predicted. Native wildlife was beginning to fight back on its own. In one widely reported case, researchers tracking a large adult male python through a GPS collar as part of a breeding study made an unexpected discovery. Instead of finding the snake alive and moving normally, they found it dead, clearly killed by another animal. Trail camera footage later confirmed the culprit. A bobcat weighing a small fraction of the python's size had managed to take down and kill the much larger predator. Wildlife biologists described the event as the first confirmed instance of its kind, a genuinely surprising role reversal for a species that had spent 2 decades as the area's dominant predator. Some researchers speculated that unusually cold temperatures may have slowed the python's reflexes, giving the bobcat an opening it wouldn't normally have. Others suggested native predators may simply be learning, over time, that these once unfamiliar giants are not invincible. That incident wasn't an isolated fluke. Additional field reports and camera trap footage across South Florida have documented alligators preying on smaller pythons, and, most relevant to this story, indigo snakes captured on camera consuming juvenile Burmese pythons in the wild. Even the endangered Florida panther has reportedly been documented interacting aggressively with pythons. None of these events suggest native wildlife is close to reversing 2 decades of damage on its own, but together they represent something meaningful. Evidence that Florida's ecosystem hasn't simply surrendered. It's adapting, however slowly, and the reintroduced indigo snakes appear to be playing a small but real part in that shift. The clearest proof that the reintroduction effort was succeeding came not from a dramatic predator showdown, but from something far quieter: baby snakes. In 2023, trail cameras at a protected preserve in the Florida Panhandle captured footage of wild-hatched eastern indigo snake hatchlings, offspring of adults that had been part of earlier reintroduction releases. Crucially, at least one of the hatchlings had never been tagged or handled by researchers, meaning it had been born entirely in the wild, without direct human assistance. For a conservation program built on years of captive breeding, habitat restoration, and careful monitoring, that discovery was the turning point everyone had been hoping for. It confirmed that released snakes weren't merely surviving in a holding pattern. They were established enough to reproduce naturally and begin building a self-sustaining population, something that had not happened in that part of Florida in roughly half a century. In the years following, monitoring teams documented growing numbers of indigo snakes across multiple counties, including individuals from years-old release cohorts that were still alive, healthy, and actively moving through restored habitat. Neighboring states have taken notice as well. Similar reintroduction efforts in Alabama have released dozens of additional snakes in recent years, adding to a growing regional total of individuals returned to their historic range, with partnerships between wildlife agencies expanding as the program's early success becomes harder to ignore. None of this is being framed by the scientists involved as a silver bullet solution to the python crisis. A single native predator species, no matter how effective, cannot single-handedly undo an invasion of this scale. What the indigo snake offers instead is a shift in balance, additional predation pressure on young pythons, competition for prey and territory, and a slow rebuilding of an ecological relationship that existed for millions of years before habitat loss and invasive species disrupted it. Looking back at the entire arc of this crisis, the most striking part isn't the size of the pythons, the strangeness of the parasite, or even the surprising footage of a bobcat outmatching a much larger predator. It's the fact that a plan mocked almost universally at first announcement turned out to be grounded in patient, methodical science rather than desperation or spectacle. While public hunts and technology-driven removal campaigns focused on direct control, chipping away at python numbers one capture at a time, conservation biologists were pursuing something slower and less visible, restoring a piece of the ecosystem that had been missing for decades. Both approaches, it turns out, were aimed at the same underlying goal, even though they looked completely different from the outside. Hunters and contractors focused on limiting the damage in the short term. Scientists focused on rebuilding long-term resilience. Neither strategy alone was ever going to fully solve a problem this large, but together they represent a more complete response than either could offer independently. The broader lesson extends well beyond Florida's swamps. Ecosystems that took millions of years to develop their internal checks and balances can be destabilized astonishingly quickly by a single introduced species, and once that balance is broken, there is rarely a simple, single-step fix available. Complex ecological damage tends to require complex, multi-layered responses, some of them slow, some of them strange-looking from the outside, and some of them, like releasing hundreds of snakes into a landscape already full of them, initially dismissed as a joke. Today, the Everglades remains far from fully recovered. Python numbers are still substantial. The lungworm parasite continues to spread through native snake populations largely unchecked, and researchers are candid that full eradication of the invasive threat is likely impossible. But there are now real, documented signs of a system beginning to push back. Native predators adapting their behavior, a once-vanishing native species reproducing in the wild again, and cross-state conservation partnerships expanding based on early results. Whether that momentum is enough to meaningfully shift the balance over the coming decades remains an open question, one that will likely take years of continued monitoring to answer. What is already clear, though, is that the plan so many people laughed at when it was first announced wasn't the reckless gamble it appeared to be. It was a long-considered, science-driven attempt to give a damaged ecosystem some of its own tools back. And against expectations, in at least a few documented and camera-verified instances, those tools have already started to work.